Hello, and welcome to another live stream. And I've got a really special guest Kelly, who I met on the Stowe Narrative Writers Lab earlier this year, which was very exciting for both of us. And we're talking about screenwriting and adapting, writing from different formats, plays, and the focus of this really is not just things that are interesting for screenwriters, but the theme is changing the world. And as you'll find out, Kelly's got some things that she'd like to change. Hello, Kelly. Now I'm going to let you pronounce your name.
Kelly Cochran-Yzquierdo.
Fantastic. And tell us about your name.
Well, the first half, Cochran, is my actually made last name, and then the Yzquierdo part is my wife's. We got married and we decided to hyphenate it, and it became entirely too long to even fit onto a credit card. So sometimes we regret that. But Izquierdo means left in Spanish. It's the old spelling with the Y instead of the I. I joke with her and said that I tell her if her last name meant right, we may never have gotten married. So.
Never got together. And with your writing, obviously we all write about things that we know about as well as things that we imagine in our head. So before I get into a little bit more about your academic work and talking about adaptations, perhaps just give me a little update on where you are in your writing career and the kind of things that you've written in the past and why you write, why it matters to you.
So I started out with I got an MA, a Master's of Art in English, creative writing, and so I've written a novel and some short stories, but I came to find out that I'm more of a visual writer. I like visual storytelling, so I eventually went back. I got a Master's of Fine Art in writing for film and television from Emerson College in Boston. And I've really found my voice in writing for that. I grew up in the 80s and 90s in Oklahoma, which is a very conservative state here in the States, and coming out as being gay was pretty much not an option in the 80s and 90s. And so now, looking back at all of my experiences, with dealing with judgment and being an outcast or put to the margins, as I like to say, I've really found that it really helps me to be able to share my experiences and to show that people are still going through exactly what I went through. Yes, it's a little bit more accepted, but in certain places it's not. So one thing for me, though, I was fortunate that my family loved me through the whole thing. So I know that there's a lot of people in the LGBTQ plus community where their families, turn their back on them, and I was one of the lucky ones. But I do like to tell about those stories, and it's not just about being part of the LGBTQ community, but it's about those experiences that we all can relate to. Self-doubt, finding yourself, finding your voice, being courageous enough to live your authentic self. And so I feel like that's where my writing is going right now. I wrote a TV pilot that's done really well on the contest circuit. It's called Club Drama. It's set in the 1990s in a lesbian bar in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. It's set right before the Oklahoma City bombing, so we see a lot of things leading up to that. But it's really an ensemble cast and what goes on in the gay community, and so especially in the mid '90s, right, when the gay epidemic or the AIDS epidemic was at its fullest, really. And so it encompasses a lot. I find, though, that a lot of my writing actually incorporates mother-daughter relationships, whether it be biological mother-daughter or whether it be, mentorships or those kinds of things. And so almost everything I write ends up having mother-daughter relationships. And so, and I've only been really aware of that since I've taken a step back and looked at a lot of it. So, And so
And those are,
that's
of course, universal, which is good.
exactly,
Good.
exactly.
So, so with you have an academic side to what you do as well. Tell us where
Yes.
when you're not writing, what are you up to?
When I'm not writing, I'm teaching writing. And so I am a associate professor at Northern Virginia Community College in Woodbridge, Virginia. And like I said, I have a master's in English, so I teach composition 1 and 2. I teach creative writing. And then I have that MFA, so I teach screenwriting also at the 100 level. So it's the beginning screenwriting. We usually deal with shorts because that's all they can really handle at that
Hmm.
level. And then I also teach film and literature, which is a lot of what we'll be talking about with the
Hmm.
adaptation. In that class, I teach the difference between film, telling a story through film, and telling a story through literature, and then how film could actually be considered as a kind of literature in a way. But I really focus in on adaptation, and it forces them to use their brain in a different way when talking about understanding story visually, and then understanding story from the reading aspect of it.
Because it's not
So
just,
yeah.
is it, about taking a story and sticky in another modality. What I've been discovering with telling the same story in radio format is it's not about reformatting it. It's actually really looking completely anew at that story and thinking how can I tell this in a way that this format supports it, and that can create quite dramatic changes sometimes. Um, so I'm really interested in what you say about it's not just a technical exercise, is it? It's about the way of looking at the story that you're trying to tell. Have what kind of adaptation do you usually find you're teaching? Is it from novel to screen? What's the usual one that you'd be starting with?
Well, usually what I end up doing is for my lectures and for the class overall, I have them read short stories that have been adapted into features, because they can read those short stories in a small window of time, and then be able to watch the film, do both over the course of a week. But then they have a semester long project where they have to pick a film that was adapted from a novel, and then they spend the semester analyzing it um, by looking at different components of the story, both as the novel and as the film, and look at the changes, the similarities, why, right? I ask them, why do they keep that? Why have they changed it? I always focus on the why, and so that they can try to analyze it and understand it. So I do a little bit of both. I have also used a play um, for an adaptation, and it tends to be slightly different because depending on which play you use and which adaptation you use, film adaptation is what makes kind of the big difference in that. And so I've used several different ones, and I try to rotate the stories, and I try to rotate those films as we go through different semesters.
Because
So
when you, particularly with a novel, I remember when I used to read for Channel 4 100 years ago, I could tell within 2 3 pages that, oh, they've adapted this from a novel. Because they would
yeah,
put and a lot of it with the giveaway was they were just putting too much description. They didn't understand that it's a different way of writing for a screenplay. But you've got so much complexity often in a novel that it's very difficult to squeeze into say a 90 or 2 hour movie. What would you say from novel to screenplay are the sort of main things that students learn and discover during that process of adaptation?
well, we know that novels usually have a lot of subplots. There's usually a lot of characters. There's a lot of exposition, and there's a lot of things that are told to us through a novel that are not visual, right? That aren't visual on the page, but it makes us create a visual picture in our brains. And so one of the biggest things that I think they have a hard time understanding is that when sometimes in novels, when you're adapting it to film, you're going to have to lose some of those characters, right? Either you lose those subplots because they aren't what you are trying to tell in the visual aspect of it, for that, or you combine characters, right? You give them dual jobs, or it's a matter too of the person who has the vision for the film as to what they want that story to end up telling, right? And that's why with novels, I know a lot of people will read a novel and then they'll go watch the movie, and then they either hate it or they love it, right? And a lot of times they hate it. If you've read the book first, then you see the film. A lot of times it's hard to compare, especially if you loved the novel. And that's because we create the film in our head. We create from what we read, right? We take those words, we decode them in our own brain and create a movie for ourselves within our imagination. And so when we go see a film that isn't exactly like we pictured it in our head, we're disappointed, right? And so it really matters who's adapting, and who's directing the film as to what ends up on the screen and what they decide to keep that is important to the overall story. A lot of those subplots really don't, I mean, they give us a lot of richness in the novel and a lot of backstory and a lot of those things. But some of those things can be and need to be cut if you're going to adapt it to the screen. Like you
Could
said,
you give some specific examples?
it's interesting, and I'll say this is that one of my and I used to be a Harry Potter freak, right? When they first came out, I love Harry Potter, read the 1,000-page books, and I would stay up for 2 days straight reading it straight through, because I thought that they were my brain, it made me just see so many great things, and I think that's why the books themselves are a classic, kind of like C.S. Lewis, the
Hmm.
Chronicles of Narnia. Generations after generations read that. I think Harry Potter's going to be the same thing, and then we get to a point where we have to, and I'm gonna put a disclaimer out there for this, where we have to separate the art from the artist. And
Yeah.
so, in my mind, Harry Potter will always be a classic because of what is actually written on the page, even if there's some controversy in dealing with the author. We as artists know that our artwork is separate from us.
Yeah.
Once you put it out into the world, it gains its own life. And so for me, Harry Potter was one of those where I read the book, then I hated the movies. And they're great movies, don't get me
Mm.
wrong. If I had never read the Harry Potter series, I would think, man, these are amazing, right? Amazing. But things that were left out, like book 4, they left out the drunk elf, right? I mean, that's great for the screen, but it was a part of a subplot,
Mm.
freeing elves and all of that, that we didn't get in the film because it wasn't part of what they were looking at as far as the main thread, right? For
And
that.
also, do you think thematically as well, if something's not very tied
Yeah.
to the main theme, you
Yeah.
have to let it go. How are there any that you would say that are, in your opinion, are really successful?
Oh, there's so many, really. I mean, for me, and this is not adapted from a novel, but actually adapted from a play. Tennessee Williams' Glass Menagerie is probably one of my favorite plays that he wrote. And there are 3 different adaptation versions of that play out there. There's a 1950s version, a 1970s version, a 1980s version that has been adapted. And I particularly actually love the 1970s version, which actually has Katharine Hepburn and Sam Waterston in it. Um, and it was actually not verbatim, right? A lot of plays you can uh, adapt and do them almost exactly.
Hmm.
The difference is changing. from one set to different locations, and that's the beauty of film, right? We can film in different locations, whereas a play is set for the stage. But the 1984 is actually almost verbatim. Uh, yeah, they changed some locations, but the dialogue and everything is pretty close. And so, for me, by changing a little bit, I liked it better than if it was exact. The 1950s version is, in my opinion, one of the worst adaptations of anything that I've seen as far as that, because they played with the plot and the structure of the plot. They moved some of the scenes around, and it's extremely important, right? How you give your audience the information when you're creating a story, right? What do you want to give them to help them understand where they are in the story so far, right? Without giving too much information to them or not enough information. And I think they really switched the plot up some and then gave it a
Why?
happy.
Why though? Why do you think so? Was it kind of they Hollywooded it or something?
It was the 1950s Hollywood ending. They wanted to make sure that it had a happy ending, which, if anybody knows any of Tennessee Williams films, pretty much don't have happy endings. And especially the Glass Menagerie. For the 1950s, they had it to where Laura was actually ended up with a gentleman caller at the end, when in the play itself, she doesn't. She's rejected again. And so it's one of those things. In the 50s, they needed to make it a happy thing. Everyone's going to the theater after the war, and they want to make sure that people are leaving the theater, happy. And so, that's where we get the happy Hollywood ending is, and
What
which is
have you?
good.
Yes, I was going to
Go.
say, with on that note, have you had seen adaptations, whether from novels or plays, to film that where they have been very creative, shall we say, but where it's worked and where you felt that it was justified?
There are some out there, and I'm drawing a blank right now. But there are some out there that have gone from, what we like to say is a close adaptation, right, where they're pretty spot on. Then you have the loose adaptations, and those are the ones that use the original material as a jumping off point, right? Or they'll use the climax or use it as a climax and then build around it. Especially with short stories. We find a lot that happens with short stories with that. An interesting adaptation is Christopher Nolan. I know he's got a new movie coming out, Oppenheimer, which is coming out next Friday. But he's one of my favorite directors, and he and his brother both put out their version of a premise with Memento, and then his brother Jonathan Nolan wrote Memento Mori, which is also, and I have my students read this because they were talking about this idea for the story, and so they both left the conversation with this idea for a story. And Christopher Nolan went to write the screenplay in his version of how this premise was, and then Jonathan wrote the short story called Memento Mori, uh, and it has the same underlying components, but they are definitely different stories. And so then that can tell you, with the idea of a story, how adapting it for film is going to be different than adapting it for the short story. And so, like, the short story is interesting because you do have some signals visually as to the components of the story. A lot of times you'll see, like with Memento Mori, there are two different types, like one's italicized and one's regular type. Italicized is in second person, talking about you, right? And so that changes the perspective of that information given to you.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, in Memento itself, Nolan played with plot structure and giving us only 10 minutes at a time going backward in time to give us the same feeling as our protagonist, what that protagonist is feeling. So when you talk about structure, you can have structure in both sense and use structure to give the reader a sense of um, feeling from the story itself. It's just a matter of how it's done. One's visual and one's actually on the page. Um, so it is similar, and it is interesting in of itself. I would say too, uh, one of the adaptations that is you talk about writing uh, a screenplay as if it was like a novel. Any of Charlie Kaufman's
Mm.
uh, scripts, he uses passive voice. He throws all the rules out the window.
Mhm.
He's Charlie Kaufman. He can do what he wants, right? So if you have ever read the adaptation of Eternal Sunshine, um,
Yes, yes.
if, um, if you watch the movie and you read the screenplay, there's a lot of changes.
Hmm.
I mean, yes, the overall feeling, the overall story is intact, but there are a lot of changes visually that you get more backstory and
Mm.
more exposition in the screenplay than you do in the actual film itself.
It made sense to me though, because I found the screenplay. I was thinking, oh my god, how am I going to understand what's going going on with this on the screenplay? But it actually is quite easy.
Hmm.
And when you're doing something as complex visually as that, I know part of it's the director bringing something, they're new to the screen, but at the end of the day, maybe it's a case of you have to write the screenplay in a way that someone reading it can follow.
Right,
Even if maybe right from the beginning you hope to do something more visually interesting, because it works brilliantly as a film, I
right,
think. But
yeah,
very difficult to just do that as like a blueprint on paper
right,
and to still have the same
exactly,
reaction. You kind of got to see it and experience to
right.
be able to go with it. Would you say that's a fair point?
Yeah, I would say that's exactly a fair point. I mean, we as screenwriters, we're told, our screenplays are the blueprint. And I always tell my students it's the skeleton, right?
Yeah.
And then of course, I assign body parts to the different aspects of filmmaking. The brain is the director, and so on and so forth. But we are as screenwriters, we write the blueprint, right?
Yeah.
And what I try to tell my students all the time, and what you have to understand is when you're reading, that's a singular focus, right? That's a singular channel. You are reading the words from the page, and your brain is interpreting and decoding that and telling you the story, right? And that's single. Whereas for film, it's multi-channel. So what that means is it's visual, it's audio, it's there are written things. You have title cards, you have those kinds of things, and so that's the beauty of film. Is it's the story is not just told on a single channel, right? We get the story not just from the pictures that we see on the screen, but from what we hear, from the editing process, from the angles of the cameras, right? From where we choose to cut, where we choose to transition, what shots we see, if we see a close up, if we see, so visual storytelling it's a collaboration, right?
And a
And it
language of its own in many ways, isn't it? Yeah.
exactly. Whereas, whatever language is your mother tongue, you read in that language and you interpret and you understand the story in that language, right? But film, like you said, has its own language, but it isn't a singular language, right? It is
And it can be very you can say, adapting something recently, a short film, the opening scene is, in 30 seconds you just know straight away what's going on up to a point.
right,
The audio
right,
version was an entire is a whole scene to take the audience on this journey so they end up knowing what's
exactly,
going on, because you can just
exactly.
do things so much more quickly visually. But do you do any, have you done any adaptations the other way around, from screenplay to novel or short story, or is it always tend to be traditionally from another one format into the screenplay?
Traditionally, it tends to go from the written word to the visual word, to the visual language. Um, I am not. I mean, I think a lot of the um, reverse could be, well, now you're getting a lot of adaptation from games
Yeah.
right into film and TV series. Like Last of Us is probably the one of the most successful adaptations as far as from a game into an actual series. That you're seeing different mediums being adapted into film, but I don't see a lot of the film coming back into the written word unless it is designed for a marketing purposes,
Yeah.
right? Oh yeah, this was such a great film. Let's put it into a book form so people can buy the book, right? And we get a lot of that back and forth with the multiverses, right? With Marvel and DC and all of those,
Yeah.
with all the superheroes and those kinds of things, which are kind of fluid. But it's a whole universe that is already established. And so I think that it's interesting, with established IP, that's the hardest part, right? Is adapting something that's already established and keeping true um, to the story, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can lose a lot of elements, but you still have to have that core story there to appeal to the audiences. And so I
Um,
think that go ahead.
I was just going to say, to round off with, what would you give to, if anyone here has, maybe they've written a short story, they've written a novel, and they're looking they want to create it and to tell that story in a visual way, what would be the key principles that you would say they need to be thinking about to do that?
I I would say that they really need to understand their characters. Um, I think that we find going from novel to film, as the writer of that novel, it's really hard to give up a lot of the backstory and a lot of the exposition. And you're correct. You can be really precise with film, and so you can tell a lot in just a 30-second scene that might take two chapters of a novel to get that out, right? And I imagine you going into audio too is going to be one of those things. What I find is interesting is if on the page, right? If on the page, or if I'm telling you, uh, if I'm using just words to tell you, okay, tree, right? When I say tree, what is it that you think about? Which tree do you see in your mind's eye, right? And that's the important thing. So if you write on the page tree, then your audience is going to fill in with what their experience is when it comes to tree. So if they love Christmas, then they might see a Christmas tree, right? If they're from the Northwest of the United States and the big redwoods, they might see a redwood. If they're from the desert, they might see a Joshua tree, right, in their minds, because that's what they're familiar with. It's the same thing I ask my students, if I write this word down, or if I tell you this word, if I say dog, what comes to mind? And 9 out of 10 times, it's their dog that comes to mind, or a dog that bit them, or their dog, or it's a personal experience, right? But in film, if we put a dog in the scene, that's the dog they see, right? That is it. If we put an elm tree, then that's the tree we're talking about.
So you need
So
to be very specific, and brief but specific. Yeah.
exactly. Visual is specific and concrete, right? Whereas words are on the page or spoken are unfixed and abstract when it comes to your audience understanding those. So that's the interesting part about being able to tell a story visually, is because you can put on the screen exactly what you're thinking, right? And they're going to respond to it exactly the way what they see. Now, they might make different meaning of that when they see it than what was the intent. But that's with all constructed realities, right? We tend to interpret things that even we see into our own perspective. So.
And you said earlier on the beginning that you discovered that you were a visual writer. How does someone know that screenwritings for them? Because it's a very particular craft. To do it well takes a lot of time and a
Right.
lot of work. It's like going from
Right.
watercolors to oils, I imagine. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff that's
Right.
different, and it's not going to be for everyone. So what's a good way to, is there a way to help someone understand whether it's naturally something they will flourish in, or that actually might be a bit of a struggle?
I think, for me, it was when I was writing short stories, and when I wrote the novel that I wrote, it was laborious. I mean, it was tedious for me. It seemed tedious, and I love to write. I love to tell stories, but it just seemed, I got bored. I got bored. And so when I discovered screenwriting, and the way that I write is I create a lot of the characters first, and then I put them in a situation, and then I do a lot of the thinking and outlining, and I write a lot of the backstory. I write a lot of things that never end up in the screenplay, but you have to know those things about the character, about the story, before you even start putting anything on the page. And what I love about screenwriting is that if you understand it and you understand how to do it, once you're ready to put the words on the page, it goes fast, right?
Yeah.
You can really produce a first draft, probably. I mean, depends on your media. If you're doing a feature, if you're doing TV, hour or half hour, I would half hour drama, or half hour comedy. You could probably get the first draft on the page if you've done all the pre work, right?
Hmm.
You've thought about the story and done all that in a day, because if you know the software and you know how to write visually, you can bang it out pretty fast. Now, it takes draft after draft after draft after draft to
Yeah.
actually get what you want. But I think that's with any writing, though.
Yeah.
The first draft is always, you know, that thing that you use to get stuff on the page, right?
Yeah.
And then you go from there.
The old
But I
vomit
think,
draft. Yeah. And
yeah,
so definitely,
exactly, the vomit draft.
yeah. So the speed. What about this? The whole kind of what it means to, which you've already touched on with visual storytelling, you need to be very specific. But is there a different process that you go through mentally when you're writing for the visual screen, or when you're writing for another medium? Because I'm finding writing for audio, radio, it's not just a technical thing of how do I let people know what's actually happening here. It's almost having to put a different, into a different brain mode to
Right.
try and get into how do I tell the story in this completely different way. And I just wondered whether you had any thoughts, with particularly with visual story, cinematic storytelling, of what kind of thinking, or way of thinking that you need to have that you wouldn't need if you're sitting there writing a novel.
I think for me, when I think back, or when I think about a story, I see it being played out in my head, right? I can see what my characters look like in my head. I can see that. And so by me being able to see it, I can describe that and put it on the page. Whereas, novel writing or prose writing, you not only have to think about what it looks like, right? But you also have to think about, how do I use imagery, and paint a picture for them, right? Because you have to paint that picture for your reader to be able to understand exactly what you're saying. And so for me, it's like a shorthand, right? Visual storytelling is a shorthand for me. Um, can I tell the story in prose? Of course I can, right? But I get really bored with that. And
Yeah.
so I think it's really, how do you see the story, right? How do you feel the story? I had a great friend who passed a couple of years back, and he was a novelist, and it oozed from his pores, right? Novelist. He was he was a wordsmith. He was, and he could spend hours and hours and hours in his writing cave, and just, he was very prolific when it came to prose. And that's what he did, and that's where he excelled, because that's how he saw his stories, right? He saw the words on the page, um, and the way that it was crafted on the page, whereas I see it the way it's crafted on the screen.
And
And
and last but not least, with your students that you have, I mean, a lot of people like the idea of writing for the screen. What
yeah,
percentage of them would you say find that actually that is something they have a real aptitude for, or would or in other words, if they don't have that aptitude, maybe realise that actually I'm better off with short stories or novel writing. Do they kind of get that sense through the course of where their sort of natural inclinations lie?
I think, with this generation, of TikTok and YouTube, and everybody thinks that if you have a phone with a camera on it, you're a filmmaker. And so, we get a lot of students that think that they're going to be the next great, producer, writer, director, all of the above, right? They want to do it all. And so when they realize that, you have to start with a script. I had one student that did a movie and then reverse engineered the script for it. Um, and I was like, what are you thinking? Well, I just started shooting. And see, that's the problem, I think, I get those first years, right? First year in
Mm-hmm.
college. Um, and a lot of them think that that's what they are going to do. They think that they are a visual storyteller, until they realize how hard it is,
Mm.
right? And it's just not putting your camera on and shooting what you see, right? I try to get them to understand, especially in narrative storytelling, in fiction narratives, that it is about constructing a reality. It isn't about shooting reality, right? And if that's the case, then documentary might be the way to go. But
Yeah,
that is constructed, right? Even what it in
totally.
film is constructed. So I think, I would say percentage of the students that I end up getting that will probably end up working in the industry, probably 20%, because they realize that, they grew up with YouTube, they grew up with TikTok, they grew up with these things. But and I found too, a lot of the students that I get that are interested in film, usually are interested in the filmmaking process, the production end, instead of the writing, are
Yeah.
those that have, learning disabilities like dyslexia, and they see things, picture wise, and so they've chosen to go the visual aspect because they can understand that. And so I find that I get a lot of film students that do have some sort of a learning disability and have problems with reading, and understanding the word on the page. And so for them, they usually go into the production end of it, whether it be cinematography, or lighting, or, sound, or
Yeah.
something like
And
that.
I don't know if it's purely by coincidence, but recently I've been starting to collaborate with more and more people who appear to be ADHD in particular, or
Yes,
sometimes other maybe bipolar as well, but have this kind of innate love of metaphor. They just connect intrinsically with drama, with through sound, in a way that's very immediate. And maybe it's just purely a
right,
coincidence, but they just seem to have, let's say, a higher sensitivity to
right,
the drama and the metaphor. Because with visual storytelling, with good filmmaking, a single word or a look can mean so many things, and
right, exactly,
nobody's writing that down and telling it to you. You just get it,
right,
and that's for me the challenge of the craft. But you also
right,
need to be someone who can respond to that and get
exactly,
that, and especially if you're going
yeah.
to be collaborating that process. So I found that quite an interesting thing I've started to notice.
I've also found that a lot of my students are neurodiverse. right?
Yeah.
And so I have a lot that are high functioning with Asperger's or those kinds of things, and they really are, they focus in more on like the editing aspect of it. And I think that comes from having, being more of a savant when it comes to certain things and understanding and being able to shift those perspectives and to to work uh, in a way that is controlled.
Non-linear. It's like it's not, and also
Exactly,
non-linear. Being able to kind of connect lots of different dots and put everything
exactly,
together. Yeah, very
exactly.
interesting.
Yeah. So I think film, really opens up a world, you know, to being able to be a part of it, right? To be able to create it. So it's very inclusive when it comes to the ability to be able to tell stories with film.
Yeah.
I think now, with and I just said a bad thing about having everybody thinking they have a camera that they can, be a filmmaker, but
But
the
they
the plus
can.
side to that, exactly, the plus side to it is if they go about it the right way, they can,
Mm.
right? And so it's we're becoming more of a visual society than a uh, literate or reading society, I think.
Mm.
And so I find my students have watched a ton more than they've read. And
Yeah,
so,
and and
um,
and and just the same way that in theory everyone can make a film, even if it's not necessarily a well structured, good,
right.
crafted one. Anyone can also start a production company. So that's what you're doing, isn't
Exactly.
it?
Yes. Yeah, I was inspired from our time at Stowe to really go out there and do it. I was trying to figure out how I was going to get some of my short made and do those kinds of things, and I thought, well, why can't I just do it myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people were telling me I have the heart of a producer, and I was like, what does that exactly mean? But I've been a manager all my life. I've managed retail and bars and restaurants, and I've managed faculty members. So I think, for me, I did start. It's in the infancy stages, but I started a production company called From the Fringe Productions. It's designed theoretically to encompass all of the marginalized people in the industry, and to bring those together and give them a place to tell their stories authentically. And that's the goal for the production company, is to be able to include women, of course, the LGBTQ plus, and also BIPOC. So, anyone who has been on the outside. And the reason why I did this is because, it's funny is that, yeah, the industry is getting more and more inclusive, right? And they're making an effort, but um, it's still the people in power that are telling us exactly how much of us we can be a
Yeah.
part. And I was like, why should they have that power?
I had
And so,
a story recently. I went to something at the BFI, and it was a talk on distribution. And one of the audience members worked with a distributor, and she said that she bought a strong female lead project, and he said, "No, we've already got one of those." and, uh,
exactly.
and
Yeah.
a lovely
Because one is enough.
yeah, and a lovely reading of a South Asian actress who was saying it's funny, she gets these parts, but there's only ever one South Asian actress in the whole program in that
Right.
town or village. Isn't that strange?
Right.
And yeah, you're
Yeah.
right, it's there, but it's still very limited, and it's not actually
Exactly.
representative of what's all around us in everyday life.
Exactly. And so that's my goal, is to use the production company to give to give writers, to give directors, to give people who want to tell their story authentically, a platform to do that without being restricted in any way, and told, nope, we have too many of those, or nope, one's enough.
Yeah.
So hopefully, maybe, in a year I'll be in a different place, and things will be doing really well, and there'll be a lot of new voices out there.
And I'll send you the links to these, and if you can maybe put your Instagram or there, so just people
Yes,
can follow and stay tuned
right.
into your journey.
I
That's brilliant.
will. I will.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I really, really appreciate it. And I look forward to speaking to you when you put on your first production, that produce your first movie. Speak
I
to you
appreciate
soon.
you having me. It's been fun.
Thank you. Bye for now.